Hi, I'm Mary Luengo from the 2020 GLI class of Cleveland. When I heard who was going to be our speaker tonight, I could not contain myself. I went and typed this very passionate email to my ADL class about how we're going to hear from one of my personal heroes. So when they asked me if I could introduce him tonight, of course I say yes. It's my deepest pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Andrew Yang. Mr. Yang was born in New York to immigrant parents from Taiwan. He graduated from Brown University and went to work on several dot-coms before becoming CEO of an educational company that later he sold to Kaplan. He founded Venture of America, an organization dedicated to rejuvenate local economies, and was named Champion by Change by the White House in 2012. Like that was not enough, he later was named Presidential Ambassador of Global Entrepreneurship in 2015. You also may recognize him for his presidential candidacy early this year. It's my pleasure to welcome Mr. Yang to LLSF.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Marie. That was such a warm and lovely introduction. It's an honor and privilege to address the Anti-Defamation League. I've been a huge fan of the organization since before John joined as its leader. John and I know each other from his days in the White House. And in preparation for today, I thought about the ADL and your mission, and it's a beautiful mission that I think everyone can embrace, which is trying to address and reduce the expressions of hate and division in our society. And I believe that that's an uncontroversial mission, or it should be in just about every context. But I wanted to frame the mission in this historical moment and ask a question for the people watching this is, do you think that hate is falling or rising right now in the United States and around the world? And when you close your eyes and think about the best possible future you can imagine, what does it look like? Now, to the first question, I believe that we are losing. I believe that hate is rising and it's being driven by some very, very significant systemic causes. And to me, the ADL should be thinking about how to address those causes as well as the manifestations. Now, by the time an official organ or a public figure makes an expression of hate, in my mind, many things have happened before that. And right now, we can see around us that our country is in terrible condition. And the riots and protests in response to George Floyd's tragic death are one manifestation. But we've been struggling with a winner-take-all economy that has left millions and millions of Americans behind for years. That is one reason why it feels like we are turning against each other. And unfortunately, that has been accelerated and made much, much worse by this coronavirus pandemic. There are 40 million unemployed Americans right now that we know of, and that is an undercount given that many people aren't in position to file for unemployment. We're talking about depression era levels of dislocation. About half of American workers are not working right now. About half American citizens, adults, are not working right now. Now, this is a tinderbox, really, because if you have tens of millions of Americans looking around who don't have jobs, they are going to respond to negative and extremist ideologies in different ways than if we had a thriving and prosperous economy and society. Now, I'm Asian American, you may have noticed, and certainly for Asian Americans, the coronavirus pandemic has brought a surge in racism against us, but it's not just us. You can see that racism has been rising in different parts of society, and anti-Semitism has been rising in different parts of society. So when you think about the best possible vision of the future, is it one where people have vastly uneven and unequal situations, but we're policing expressions of hate? Or is it one where there's enough to go around? What's fueling much of the hatred in our country right now is scarcity, really. That there is this idea that there's not enough to go around and some have it more than others. I remember when I was a college student, uh, well, uh, when I was a college student, again, I'm Asian, so I showed up to college and I went to an Ivy League school, and 15% of the student body was Asian American. And that was a lot relative to our proportion of the population. Uh, but I was talking to a Jewish classmate of mine at school, and then they pointed out to me that the proportion of Jewish classmates in our class was significantly higher still. Now, that was complete news to me, but what that says is that there are certain people in our country that have at least the perception that we are prosperous. And then there are other certain groups in our country where there's a perception and a reality that they have less. And unfortunately, in this latter group, these are people of color, Black communities, Latino communities. The average Black household has a net worth of only 10% that of a white household. For Latinos, it's about 15%. Now, these are the real disparities in our country, and this pandemic has demonstrated to us that these disparities can kill. They are lethal. We are seeing there are much, much higher rates of fatality among Black communities and communities of color than any other community. And the killing of George Floyd is not just a reflection of police forces that have um, lost their way and become oppressive to certain groups of people, but it's also a reflection on poverty, where if you look, George Floyd was arrested for allegedly using a counterfeit $20 bill. These are the things that are making us feel like we are losing. Like this sense of scarcity is turning us against each other, because it is. And this time we're in, this new pandemic driven Great Depression, is a time of historic challenge. If we just try to police statements of hatred when they reach the media, we are far, far too late. We have to go much, much earlier in the chain of this rampant inequality and deprivation and scarcity that is killing people and tearing us apart. Now, what is the opposite of scarcity? What is the path forward? How can we actually make progress on the ADL's historic mission of reducing hate? The opposite of scarcity is abundance. That is our only path out of this. That is our only way to provide a secure path forward for tens of millions of Americans who right now are looking around wondering where their next paycheck is going to come from, how they're going to pay for next month's groceries, how they're going to keep a roof over their families' heads. That to me has to be our shared mission if we are truly going to create a future that is not riven and torn apart by hatred. I wish I had better news. I wish I was more optimistic. I listened to Jennifer's comments about some of the great leaders in our country. And there are people who are doing great work, but they need help. They need your help. They need my help. They need our help. We have the most extreme winner take all economy in the history of the world, and that was before the crisis. Now we have kicked 40 million Americans out of the workforce. About 16 million of them have lost their jobs forever. That is 2 times the Great Recession in perpetuity. So if we're going to combat hatred, we have to combat the conditions of scarcity that lead our country to become a tinderbox of and for hatred. That is my mission. That's the mission of my organization, Humanity Forward. And when I was reflecting on the mission of the ADL, I thought to myself, the ADL could actually be named Humanity Forward, because that is your mission. Your mission is actually to elevate us as a country, as a species, as a world, to try and move us to a point where when we see people who are different from ourselves, we don't reflect so much on those differences, but on the commonalities. And that will only be possible if people feel secure in themselves, their families, and their families' future. So very happy to be here to address you all. Very happy to share some time with my friend Jonathan Greenblatt, and really thrilled with the passion and energy that drives your community, because we need you. We need you to lead folks to see others and ourselves. We need people to be able to lead with empathy and to think bigger about the challenges that are facing us in unprecedented fashion right now. Thank you very much, ADL. Very much looking forward to hopefully sharing some time with you all in the near future.
That's Andrew. That is so awesome. It's great to have you here. I got to tell you, like I've always admired your energy and your creativity, and it's just such a treat to see what you've done in the last few years. And if anyone out there, if you're looking for a good book, Smart People Should Build Things was something I read, I don't know, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, Andrew, which was
That's kind of
very,
you, John.
it's true. I'm the guy, I read it, it was great. And I think your Twitter feed every day like comes right from the heart, and I so appreciate it. So there are some questions in the chat that I'd love just to raise. But before I do that, I just want to ask you, like, I remember when you started Venture for America, and I remember when that was building out. One of my White House interns, Gabe Cunningham, went to work for you in Detroit, if you remember that way back. So what do you think is the role of entrepreneurship to create opportunity for communities of color? And how can entrepreneurship specifically help to pull us through this time for communities that don't have the access necessarily to capital or the history of wealth creation that other communities do?
Thanks, John. I spent a number of years trying to make that happen in Cleveland, in Detroit, in New Orleans, and around the country. And if you're in a community of color and you're starting a business, you're starting with a lower capital base, lower access to capital, often lower access to mentorship that can help you launch a business successfully. So we need to try and address each of those things. And to me, this is an area where the public sector has to play a massive role, where for the government, for example, to say, look, we're going to spend $10 billion on infrastructure in this community, and a significant proportion of it's going to minority-owned firms in the community, that can help jumpstart enterprise and entrepreneurship in those communities. Most people know I'm very passionate about universal basic income, which I believe is a precursor to entrepreneurship in many communities, particularly for women in communities of color. To me, women are the greatest untapped resource in business and entrepreneurship today, because they're right now the barriers I mentioned apply to women just as much as communities of color. And if we can lift those barriers, we would see so many new businesses take form and organizations take form in communities around the country.
I love it. So let's talk a little bit about, and I'm looking at questions that are coming in through the chat. As you mentioned before, and you and I have written together about rising anti-Asian racism and rising anti-Semitism spawned by COVID-19. I wonder how you think about how we as a Jewish community and the Asian community can work together to combat rising hate. Like, what do you think? What form does that take? What does that look like to fight the rise of racism? And I should say, by the way, we're concerned about it here because I'm very worried about what the president's doing with China already on the campaign trail, right? Like the denigrating and the slamming on it. Like, it seems to create the conditions, Andrew, with this issue could actually get worse before it gets better.
Well, certainly Trump has taken on a strategy of blaming China for COVID-19 as a means of distracting from his administration's botching the response. But one of the side effects of that has been to fan the flames of anti-Asian racism. And like you said, that's also gone hand in hand with increases in anti-Semitism. The big thing I want to suggest is that even if we're successful in removing Trump from office this fall, which I believe we will be, this does not actually solve many of the problems we're talking about. There will still be anti-Asian racism and anti-Semitism, even if it's not emanating from the White House. But I agree that Donald Trump has definitely cast China as the enemy in a way that is negative for Asian Americans around the country.
So you're the son of Taiwanese immigrants. All Jewish people, their parents, their grandparents, great-grandparents, maybe the case, came from somewhere else. I wonder about how we can be effective. And again, I'm getting the question from the chat. How can we be effective allies and combat anti-blackness in our own communities? Because there's racism in the Jewish community and the Asian community against kind of other minorities. How do you think about that?
I love this question because I think one of the most powerful ways that we can fight anti-Semitism and anti-Asian racism is to stand up for other victims of racism. And to me, what's happening uh, to Black people around the country is a flashpoint. And so if Jews and Asians stand up for uh, African Americans around the country, then that will send a very clear message that racism is unacceptable no matter who it's directed toward. And so I would certainly urge Asian Americans to see it that way. And I believe that
Mhm.
if Jewish people, and I believe, in your case, this is very natural, John, but like I think if Jewish people were to take up the cause of African Americans, it would go a very, very long way.
I certainly agree with that. And I would certainly agree that I think we can do more to call it out in our own ranks, in our own community, right? Sometimes when people aren't looking, that's when what you do matters the most, you know? When you don't get any
Well,
credit for it.
what I'll say, John, is I'm a child of the 80s and 90s, and to me, it's natural just to think of Black people and Black culture as like the only way a non-white person like myself could ever be cool. So I spent the 90s trying to, like emulate hip hop culture and the rest of it. So to
Right.
me, like anti-Black racism just seems like the most ridiculous thing in the world because, to me, yeah, like I emulated. And now maybe that's not very cool to say, but let's just say like I admired African Americans throughout my entire childhood.
Well, I know you've got the cool factor, Andrew, because my boys wear their math hats around the house still. As you know, one of my kids went as Andrew Yang for Halloween this past year. So I thought that was particularly great. You're cool when you're a Halloween costume, Andrew. I got to tell you, you crossed.
Well, yeah, no, please thank your boys for me for sure. I don't know if my organization got a royalty on that costume.
They shared the video of you on you did some campaign event where you got on a skateboard, and my kids were like, Dad, Andrew Yang is so much cooler than you. Look at what he does at the office. Why don't you do this at the office? So that really impressed them.
Well, they
I'm
don't
going
know
to
how
put the
cool their
video of
dad
you and
is.
your skateboard in my Twitter feed after this show everyone I'm talking about. So let me ask you like one last question again, pulling from the chat. And I should say for anyone at home, ADL is a nonpartisan organization. We don't take positions in elections. But I did want to ask you one last thing, Andrew. When we first met, you were a social entrepreneur building an amazing organization to create opportunities for people, as you were saying, in these kinds of cities that we're rebuilding. What did you learn from your time on the campaign trail? Like, what are some of the big lessons that you took away from this journey that you had, traversing America? I would love if you could share with us just a little bit of your insight.
It was the journey of a lifetime, and what I learned is that most Americans are good and they want the same things that you and I want for us and our families. They just want to feel like their kids are going to grow up in a society and an economy that gives them um, a chance of living better than their parents did. And because that's gotten lost, people are lost. People are looking around saying, what is going on? Why is college 2.5 times more expensive? Why can't I afford health care? I thought I did the right things. And their trust in institutions is slipping away very, very quickly. And we have to
Yeah,
dig deep and look at ourselves and say, why has this trust been lost? To me, it's wholly legitimate, John, that many Americans around the country do not feel like our leaders have actually had their interests at heart over the last number of years as their costs went up and their wages stayed the same and we decimated the most common jobs in their communities. So that's what we have to address. And if we fail to address that, then nothing else is going to work.
for sure. Nothing else. I agree. Like this, ultimately, if we can extend opportunity, there should be nothing political about presenting people with a chance to kind of move up, to give their kids what they need to live, fruitful and productive lives. That to me, there's nothing
Yeah,
political about that at all.
it's apolitical. It's something that we can all get behind, and that's what I encountered out on the trail. Republican, Democrat, Independent, like they all have that feeling. It's one reason why, frankly, a candidate like me could do well is that people are looking for something new and solutions oriented from outside of Washington, because people have lost faith that the solutions will come out of Washington. They've also lost faith that a lot of the honest discussions will be had in our national media companies too. So we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah. Well, as you think about that work, I'll just tell you, ADL would love to find ways to work with Humanity Forward. I think together we could do some great things. So just thanks for your leadership, man. Thanks for your public service. And I just can't wait to see, what we do together.
Me too, John. All the best to your boys and your family. Be safe out there and keep up the awesome work, ADL. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.